Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you very much for finding me in this crowded world of YouTube orchid video channels. Now, if you're vaguely curious, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from much knowledge from greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers. Really, it's just my natural conditions, either inside or outside or not at all. Much as I'd love a greenhouse, I don't have one. So if they sound like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday, pretty amateur ramblings, but you never know. Sometimes there are successes and it might help you navigate the way through your own orchid journey. And the bus is stopping today on the orchid journey at this cute little thing, this terrestrial orchid, and it is one of the many types of Habenaria. So yes, plant lovers, we are going to take a bit of a deep dive look into this lovely group of orchid. Well, this particular orchid, Habenaria. And this one is a primary hybrid and its name is Habenaria Galah. Now, I'm just going to drop in a licensed picture of a galah, which is an incredible cockatoo in Australia, which is pink and grey, beautiful. And you can maybe see, I'm presuming that's where the name comes from, but who knows? Anyway, this is a fairly recent hybrid and it was brought into creation only in 2020, so 5 years ago. But there we are. Such a pretty thing. Now, some of the flowers are just going over. I probably waited a little too long to make this video, but never mind. It's a little tricky. So I thought, this is my second year with it. Success. However, there have been deep and tragic failures, plant lovers. So I thought, why don't I wrap it all up in a little video and talk to you about how I have been growing Habenaria successfully and unsuccessfully. All right, first things first, Habenaria, great name. And it actually is from the Latin, which means thong, or not that sort of thong, a thong, as in a rein or a strap. And that comes from the formation of some of the flowers in some of the species types that have a sort of an extension hanging down that looks like a set of reins from a horse. Interesting sidebar. I used to teach English in Spain many, many moons ago, and rein was one of my favorite homonyms because R-E-I-N, rain, R-A-I-N, rain, da, 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 and then R-E-I-G-N, rain, as in the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. I always loved the word rain. Anyway, this is R-E-I-N, rain, and yeah, refers to some of the formation of the flower of some species. Described in 1805, so relatively early on in the piece. And what I didn't know, plant lovers, which is the amazing thing about having an orchid and then deciding to just peel off the onion layers a little bit, is that Habenaria basically exist all over the world, except Europe. So they kind of start in southern USA, Central America, and northern South America, and then swing across through most of sub-Saharan Africa, up through India, Southeast Asia, all the way up through Japan, Taiwan, China, all the way up to Siberia, and then out across the Pacific, so into Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia, and the Pacific Islands. I didn't know that there are 17 species of these little babies in Australia. I just always assumed they were Southeast Asian. So yeah, there you go. They're kind of everywhere. Love to see the Siberian ones. Goodness, they must have a very particular lifestyle. Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute because this one has a very particular lifestyle and life cycle, which is a little tricky. So most of the Habenarias are terrestrial or lithophytic, but I think in this case, you know, there are terrestrials and the terrestrials and the terrestrials. So some, like a terrestrial plant, you imagine it's grounded in the earth and has deep roots that go right down. And yet some plants are really just sort of lurking on the surface. So in mounds of moss and leaf litter. So although they're growing on the forest floor, they don't perhaps penetrate that deeply. And then lithophytic, in the case of some of these, again, that sort of nooks and crannies in rocky areas where leaf litter and matter and a bit of moss is collected, and the plant gets an ability to get its roots into that material and thrive and survive, and then its own drop leaves add to the nutrients. So quite a particular growth position for many of these. But again, those species from the Americas all the way across to Siberia, there is going to be 1,001 variations on their climatic and growth requirements. So good to do your research. I would say though that pretty much most of the ones you're going to find in horticulture are from this neck of the woods, and we'll just get to the species origins of this, which have very particular and kind of easy to get your head around care instructions. Well, easy to understand, not that easy to execute successfully. All right, so let's look at this one particularly, Habenaria Galah. So this is a primary hybrid between two species, and it was created in 2020. And one of them is Habenaria janellehayneana, named after Janelle Hayne, who is actually Australian. So this is described as being lithophytic and growing near waterways. Interesting in that I went to the Amazon once, and the most light and the most variation is, of course, along watercourses because there are no trees to shade. So on the edges of rivers and streams, there is more light than in the forest, obviously. But that's where you get the most variety of flowers, particularly because otherwise all the flowers are high up in the canopy, epiphytic things in the trees themselves, because the forest floor is quite dark. So where there's water, there's more light and there's often more flowering things. So interesting that this is described as growing, well, the ancestor of this is growing in that type of environment. So although it might be a shade lover, it's going to get quite a lot of reflected light from the water, but also dappled light because it's in a brighter spot. So we'll get to light in a minute with mine. And it is from northern Thailand. So yes, it is hot, intermediate to hot, it's described. Relatively high-ish elevations, but it's certainly not cool. So definitely an indoor plant. But as it's seasonal, basically it just needs warmth and humidity during its growing period, which is sort of spring, summer, early autumn. So it does go dormant in winter. So in fact, if you've got warmish summers, such as like New York, for example, you could probably grow this outside as a potted plant and then just bring it inside the minute it started to get chilly in autumn, and it's going to go into dormancy anyway and just keep it warm and dry in winter, but we'll get to that. Now, the other ancestor of this is Habenaria Galah, and that has a much wider distribution from Thailand down into Malaysia. A bit lower elevation, but still that warm, seasonally wet, humid conditions. Imagine Thailand. I'm sure everyone's been watching White Lotus, though I haven't. So just imagine Thailand. You can imagine the type of warmth and humidity that these plants experience. That ain't what they're going to get in Melbourne. But anyway, this one's managed reasonably well. So described as growing in pretty similar-ish conditions, though not particularly in relation to watercourses, but nonetheless a terrestrial species that is a forest dweller, limestoney cliffs too, so you can imagine, I mean, it's an undulating landscape. So yeah, relatively dappled light. Anyway, those are the two species ancestors. So from the same neck of the woods, the same rough climatic conditions, very different to mine. So the peak season of these, you kind of need a lot of bright light. You need great light, I think, the right sort of light, great ambient warmth and as much humidity as you can muster, which I don't because I'm inside anyway, and that's going to make these thrive. But nonetheless, I've done really well with this one, so I'm really happy. However, let's get to the crux of Habenaria for me, which I think is the tricky bit about them, is that they're terrestrial and they are herbaceous, i.e. they die down. So it's sort of a tuber. So you might think of plants like, I don't know, well, bulbous plants like daffodils and tulips that do all their work and then die down and rinse and repeat. Tuberous plants, some irises have tubers, dahlias have tubers, peonies have tubers. Anyway, so you get the gist of it. However, again, with bulbous types of plants, the same with orchids, some of those plants are used to having moisture during their dormancy period and others aren't. So it really depends where they come from. So these come from a sort of a monsoonal, cyclical climatic area, which means they get an awful lot of heat and moisture and humidity at a particular point in the year, and then a very marked dry season, which is bone dry, but still hot and humid, but no rain. And I wonder actually, plant lovers, how the humidity actually affects the soil. Now, I've been in areas, monsoonal areas in the dry season, and the soil is just bone dry. And yet there are things like mosses and ferns. So they've obviously evolved to cope with it, but there must be some element of moisture that they're getting. Anyway, so I wonder, the fact being, if you give these a bone dry dormancy, they will desiccate and die. So I did that 2 years in a row with different plants, unfortunately. Once the plant was dying down, you know, this one's starting to turn. Once the leaves had started to die down, I then ceased watering and I put it in a dark, warm spot and just left it. And then in early spring, I went, hurrah, I'm now going to repot it in beautiful fertile soil and begin the whole magic process. Nothing there. It had just desiccated and shriveled to nothing, and it was gone. Gone, gone, gone. So I thought, okay, bought more. So I actually bought this one and another one of a different color at the same time, and I thought, okay, What I now need to do is just give them a little bit of moisture during that dormancy period, because obviously the bulbs need something to maintain their fleshy juiciness, otherwise they desiccate. But of course, the big risk with a tuber is that it's going to rot if it's too wet. So I then just did a little bit, literally like a dribble of water, maybe once a fortnight, once every 3 weeks during the winter period, very occasionally moistening the surface. Exhibit A survived, thrived, flowered. Exhibit B, which you can't see because it's long gone to the compost bin, rotted away to nothing. Now, the soil was never consistently wet. It wasn't wringing wet. And I gave both pots the same care, really. One of them just didn't like it. It was just that bit too much water, I think. So this is the tricky bit with Habenaria, just making sure that you keep them really dry, but not bone dry, with a little bit of moisture, but not too much. I think perhaps the best way to navigate that is to mist the surface of the soil once every 2 or 3 weeks, so that you're not drenching it, but there's a little bit of moisture in there that the soil can absorb and the tuber can absorb perhaps as well. Or if you've got them in a terracotta pot. Now, I hadn't, because I was just experimenting. I am going to repot this now that I know what I'm doing. If you have terracotta, one of the great things about those is that you can actually just mist the pot, and that often absorbs water. So you could do that like every 2 weeks as well. Just really drench the outside of the pot, and that might well be enough moisture to get the tubers through the dry season. Now, on those two species ancestors, I'm not quite sure what the characteristics of each were intended to mix to create this beautiful flower, because both of them have a range of colours. Janellehayneana is certainly a stronger sort of salmon pink, whereas Carnea is much more on the paler side, so maybe it's just that. But the flower shape seems to look quite similar in both. But anyway, I think perhaps one might have more flowers branching than the other. Anyway, who knows? Nonetheless, it's a very beautiful hybrid. Now, the Australian Habenarias, which I didn't know existed, are all in the north of the country, so Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and Queensland, so in the tropical part of our country, which has that monsoonal weather system as much as other parts of Asia do. So very, very dry winter periods, and then incredible amounts of moisture and humidity. And look, here is a picture of one. So this is my Bible of Australian Orchids, the Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols, an amazing book. Alas, out of print, I think, but you will find various editions on the secondhand market. And look at this great illustration, which I will show you there, of Habenaria ferdinandii. Now, Baron Ferdinand von Müller was one of the early pioneers of the Royal Botanic Gardens here, and I wonder if Ferdinandii refers to him, because he was a great proponent of understanding Australia's flora. Anyway, a white flower, there you go. So actually, if I could ever get my hands on some of those Australian tubers, you could certainly grow them here in Melbourne, as long as you had the right ambient warmth and humidity during the spring-summer period to get them to flourish. Okay, so the dormancy thing, that's the tricky bit about Habenaria. Now, they're terrestrial, so the mix that I've got them in is a mix of small bark, regular potting mix, something organic. So I use a little bit of fertilizer, sort of broken down manure, and you could use perlite as well. So it wants to be kind of light and well drained, but a bit more grainy and soil-like than perhaps your average mix. So yeah, just a light, very nutritious mix, because these plants put on a lot of energy for one period of time and then die down. So there needs to be enough nutrient in that soil. But it does need to be free draining, because although some of them do come from those moist spots, in pot culture, you kind of don't want it to be wringing wet. But in that growing period, you are watering them quite frequently. So it's a good idea to water something frequently, that it can retain the moisture, but it drains quite freely. So yeah, mine is just a mix. You could use out of the bag orchid mix, which is a bit more grainy, although the bark bits are quite large. Or yeah, just make up your own. Perlite and a regular compost potting mix would be fine, I think. Now, this one has got 3 growth points, and one of them is a little more juvenile, which is that one in there, and it didn't flower. But they spread, they multiply relatively quickly. Now, I haven't repotted this one yet. I was just seeing if I could get it through the year, which I did. It's flowered for me. So I bought it this time last year, actually, at the Oscov Orchid Fair, the Orchid Species Society of Victoria's, one of its yearly sales. And in autumn, obviously, these are all in bloom. So I bought this from Michael Coker, who I've made videos about. We made a video about deflasking and a video about phragmopediums. Michael's a wonderful grower. So I bought 2 from him. One died because I rotted it, one's thrived. And so next year I'm going to repot it because I know what I'm doing now. So here we are. It is now early autumn. These flowers put on all their growth from spring through summer, and then towards the end of summer they'll start to produce their flower buds. And the flowers, although they look quite fleshy and delicate, these have lasted well over a month. You can see that there's 2 just starting to go over here. But the more flower heads you get on your stem, the more longevity you're going to get. So surprisingly long lasting, I would say, for something that doesn't look as though it would. And there's no fragrance from these. It's really all about the color, I think, for them to attract their pollinating friend. So once the plant has finished flowering and it flowers in early autumn, as you can see already the leaves are starting to turn. Now, I have a question for myself, for you. They're shady terrestrial plants, so obviously anything that's growing on the forest floor is going to get all of that dappled light from the canopy, depending on the type of forest it's in, whether it's deciduous or evergreen. These are in tropical forests, which would be evergreen. But as we heard, one of these species grows by waterways, so it's going to get a bit more refracted light from the fact that it's in a more open area. So slightly different conditions. So I put mine in bright indirect light, and I wonder if actually it was too bright. Although other images I've seen of the mature plants, the leaf tips do start to brown relatively quickly, but I wonder, I might try and give it a little more shade-ish, but it still wanted that really bright light for me. So mine's on the landing in a northern window. In the southern hemisphere, that's where the brightest light is. In the northern hemisphere, it'd be a south window, and it's really warm. I try to water it every other day, so to keep the soil moist and to keep the saucer moist, which just creates a little bit of ball of humidity, and I would mist it when I walk past because it's with other things that like that condition, and it did really well. So autumn, flowers, leaves start to turn, it starts to die down. Now, as it's on its death throes, really just reduce the watering, and then when there's not much left that's green, I would just stop, let it go into dormancy. Once all the material has died, you can cut that off and then maybe give it a couple of weeks, and then you might want to repot it. So what I'm going to do is wait till it's really gone into dormancy. So all of this goodness from the leaves have gone back into the tuber, trim off the dead foliage, give it a little bit of time, and then I'm going to repot it in a small terracotta pot with that same nutrient-rich soil, and then very occasionally moisten the pot and perhaps moisten the top of the soil, but not too much. Otherwise it will rot like that. And then you wait. Then you get your first sort of green shoots of new growth in spring, and then start to water it more regularly and in greater degrees, and then start to add a soluble liquid fertilizer, such as, I think to begin with, something that's more of a tonic than a fertilizer, till the plant really gets going. So you've already got quite a nutrient-rich soil. I would put a little bit of slow-release fertilizer on the top, and then as well, give it a very diluted liquid feed every 2 or 3 waterings throughout its peak growing period, which is spring, summer, and then towards early autumn, it's going to start winding that down. So I've stopped feeding mine now, but I'm still watering it, and I am still occasionally giving it a bit of a tonic, not a fertilizer. So then temperature-wise, yes, they come from the tropics, but they have this dormancy period, so it doesn't kind of matter that much, although I wouldn't be keeping those tubers cold. So ideally, really for me, it's an indoor plant. I think given that my summers are so warm and I could keep them humid and moist, I probably could grow this outside in the summer period. It will probably love it, but certainly bring them inside in winter when they start to go into dormancy. But imagine, it comes from the mountains of Thailand. That ain't the lowlands of Melbourne. But anyway, so figure that out as you go. But the ambient temperature inside for me on that window, where it's getting really quite bright light all day, it's really a pocket of warmth, and I just have to try and maintain the humidity. So I would say though, although we said this does come from a very humid environment, mine's inside in this house and it's not particularly humid. We don't have a humidifier, or as I've said in the beginning, I don't use equipment. So it kind of has to make do. The most I ever do is mist it, and there's often a little bit of water in the base here. But other than that, it seems to have managed quite well with my indoor conditions. But if you've got a greenhouse or a shade house that's much more humid, it's probably going to love that even more and might even thrive more. Although I think mine's thrive. But anyway, not having tropical humidity isn't a deal breaker, I think. If you can get the dormancy thing right, they're easy and they're so beautiful. And in a small, wide pot, the more that you can bulk them up, the more glorious they are. So I think the best way to be thinking about this too is that when bulbs are in active growth, or tubers in this case, that's when they need as much energy and as food as possible. Hence, you planted this in a nutrient-rich soil and you're giving it a topical slow-release fertilizer and then feeding it as it's going, so that the tubers are absorbing lots of energy. They can put it into the growth. That energy then returns back to the tuber as it dies down. Your tubers start to expand. They will increase, and you'll start to get a really gorgeous clump. So I think a pot with sort of 5 or 6 growth points of this will be stunning. Now, from a hybridizing perspective, there are many of these around now, although this is only 5 years old, this hybrid, but lots of different colors, from really bright orange to red to white to pinks, magentas, everything in between. Beautiful forms. I'm going to try and find another one that's a different color, stronger color, because I love it. And I think I figured it out anyway. Now, I just wanted to compare and contrast terrestrial orchids, because not all of them are created equally. And this one is my Stenoglottis longifolia, which is an African terrestrial plant. Look at that. And it's just coming into spike. And in fact, you can just see the beginnings of the flowers there, just beginning to open. Beautiful magenta flowers on a very long spike. They open sequentially, and this lasts for months. So again, it's autumn, this one's coming into bloom. But this plant is more like your average bulb, perhaps, in that it doesn't really matter if this gets moisture throughout the year. I mean, you don't want to drown it, but this one just sits in the same spot. It gets watered as other things are watered around it. So even in winter, it's getting rained on, it's getting moist all the time, but the tubers are able to manage that. So, you know, like many things, there are terrestrial orchids that like very different conditions to others. So you can't kind of lump them all in the same dish. I think if you gave this one a really hard dormancy, it would really not love it and desiccate. But anyway, there, plant lovers, is the moral of the story in terms of researching your plant. And I think I've said this before, but a great source of information for species plants like Stenoglottis here is orchidspecies.com, and you can research where it came from and what its conditions ideally are. And for hybrids like this, you can go to orchidroots.com. You'll find out, put in the name of your hybrid, and it will tell you what the species ancestors are. You can then go back to orchidspecies.com and have a look at where that grows in the world, but particularly what its climatic cycles might be. So does it have a dry season or does it not? That's the key thing. Anyway, I think a lot of these Habenarias that you find in cultivation are all hybrids from those Southeast Asian ones, which do tend to want that dry, almost bone dry dormancy, but not quite. Anyway, plant lovers, there we are. My Habenaria discourse is done. I'm loving it. It's relatively easy. Now I think I've got it right. I'm going to try one more and we'll see. Maybe this time next year I can talk about more failures. But it's a learning curve, isn't it, plant lovers? We all live and learn. Anyway, I love this. It's such a beautiful, delicate flower, really long lasting, gorgeous, because it's quite low down. There's pings of color. It's a divine thing. Anyway, now, if you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe. I have no idea what it might be. It'll be some rambling, but it might be of interest to you. So hit subscribe and see what I'm doing next Friday. And I hope all's well in your world, that your orchids are treating you fine. We're having a long, warmish autumn here in Melbourne. It's been unusually warm, actually. And so it's great. It's really great orchid weather, but it's going to turn anyway. Luckily, you in the Northern Hemisphere are entering the joys of spring. We are not. But until next week, take care wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you on Friday.